get up the
Yeah.
PowerPoint.
If you cannot see the presentation or you cannot hear us, please somebody come up and let us know that that's the case.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I am Laura Helsby. I'm technically a third year PhD student now, and my background research is kind of my background's in psychology, and my research is kind of focused broadly on like well-being and how games can be used to help with mental health and various aspects of that.
I am Guilherme. People call me G. My background is in AI and machine learning data analysis, and I'm currently researching strategies in video games.
Okay, so the focus of this presentation is on mood. My research is a little more broad than that, but just for the purposes of this, we're just focusing it down on the narrow. So mood is specifically, when I talk about it, is a temporary state or feeling. And there can be both negative moods, which are kind of the obvious anger, guilt, feeling sad, but there's also positive moods. And something I found quite interesting from my research so far is that people tend to be a lot vaguer when describing positive moods. They tend to just say that they feel good without kind of quantifying it beyond that. So I put, why does it matter? I feel like a lot of people already care about this from talking to people at the conference, which is really nice to hear. But essentially, if mood is temporary, it can still have a big impact on you in the long term. If you play a lot of the same kind of game, it's important to kind of realize why you were affected by that game in certain ways. And it obviously has applications in mental health and well-being, but there's also applications in game design, because if you as a designer can understand what kind of effect your game might have on different people, then that can help you better design for that effect or mitigate for effects you don't want. So I'll just briefly talk about this study as an example of kind of the research that exists in this area. So this is Risanello from 2009. And basically they used three, what they called casual games, which I'll get onto in a bit. But they compared the effects of playing these games for 20 minutes on 134 participants. And they found that the games kind of had slightly different effects as measured by survey and physiological measures. So you can see here, this is kind of, they found that all three games improved mood. Bejeweled, for example, decreased stress and depressive type behaviors and anger. Peggle also decreased anger, but it resulted in kind of more excited moods. And Bookworm Adventures had actually kind of the least effects. The only thing they really found is that it improved mood generally and decreased confusion. So this is kind of an example of how three surface level games that might seem quite similar can actually be quite different in their effects. And then they just kind of did a follow-up study, particularly looking at depressive symptoms. So this was a slightly longer than the one-off 20-minute play session. And they found that the games decreased depressive symptoms after a month period, playing 3 times a week for 30 minutes. So I chose that study. There are many, many, many studies I could have chosen. I chose that study kind of just as an example. This area, if you go kind of beyond mood, is very varied, and there's sort of a lot of different ways you can look at this topic. So if there is that many, you might wonder what I'm doing trying to enter this area. And I found that there are a lot of limitations within this area. So typically there's a lot of bad control activities. So the experimental group will play the game. The control group will do something very different a lot of the time. There's a lot of other kind of methodological problems. And there's this very strong attachment to genre, which I'm not going to talk about in detail now because I do not have time. But people use genre very specifically and also very differently. So people may talk about action games, and a lot of researchers may talk about action games, and they're all talking about different kinds of games. So that's just kind of a problem to be aware of. But the biggest problem that I have found is that people don't ask the groups they're looking at what they actually like to play. So I'm personally interested in persistent low mood, sort of depressive disorders and related things. And I really struggle to find qualitative research focusing on that topic. So as an example of this, I brought along a gamer and a researcher, and he's going to talk about his experience playing competitive games, and then we're going to come back to me talking a bit about the research I've done.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the competitive perspective that I have on these games. Laura mentioned a lot of good, positive things about casual games, and I'm going to use these competitive games to explore the more negative moods that were addressed at the beginning. I want to preface this by saying that I am very passionate about competitive games, and I'm about to show them on a very bad light in some cases, but there's a lot of positive things that come out of it, and I would love to talk about it, but it would be a 1 hour talk about how good competitive gaming is. So if you want to talk about it, come to me later. Why should you trust me, somebody who's not in psychology but is talking about moods? Well, it's because I'm a competitor. This is the results of about a recent competition I went to. You can see that's me right there. I've been doing this for about 5 years, been competing for about 5 years. I've traveled all over the UK and Europe to do this, so I take this quite seriously. And I've experienced firsthand a lot of the negativity that can stem from the more negative moods that come out of these games. I didn't plan this, but it actually lines up with a lot of what Charlene said in terms of failing as well. And it all stems from my experience from player frustration. So how does frustration come about? It's actually quite simple. There is an expectation that is not met by the reality, right? That's the most common cause of almost anybody's frustration, in my experience, of everybody's frustration with games. And the most common way we see it is result expectation. We expect to win, and then we lose. We've all been there. It's frustrating, especially when we feel cheated. But the most common thing you'll hear people talk about in the competitive scene is not necessarily the results, but the game itself. So let's say that, for example, you're an aggressive player, so you like to put a lot of pressure on your opponent. You expect the game to reward that kind of behavior. But there's other players who are very defensive and prefer to take their time and be more patient, and they expect the game to reward that type of behavior instead. There's two different players with two very different expectations when they meet. And when you consider that games nowadays have tons and tons of characters that all play differently, suddenly you can't satisfy everybody. You can't meet everyone's expectations, which means you're going to be frustrating a lot of people. This frustration is usually what, in my experience, leads to the sore loser, if you will, the toxic behavior in competitiveness. And I'll give you an example here. This is a tweet made by a top player who had just played against a character called Joker. And as you can see, the result was not what this person expected. So they went to Twitter to vent, perfectly normal behavior. But you will see that this kind of frustration then led to negative responses, which then escalated to angry and very toxic responses after that. And this is all kind of propelled by what we know social media helps people propel, this kind of extreme negative emotions. And so we kind of normalize this, whether we like to or not, because this is what we see a lot of the times, even though it's actually not common behavior in person. So what are we doing now? We see that this is a problem. We see that there's a lot of frustration that leads to this toxicity. So a lot of players have started to fight this and have started to include some more positivity in the way they interact with other people. In some cases, they try to find the fun in the game that has nothing to do with the results or with their expectations in any way. And in some of the cases, they try to understand the game better, because that way they can build better expectations and find the game a lot less frustrating. And it might seem that I'm rambling a little bit here. It seems that I've gone a little bit away from player mood, but the truth is that I think this is a lens that's not very explored. My background is not psychology, and it's not in this kind of investigation, but I have a lot of firsthand experience on how to deal with frustration. And I find that even in casual games, we've all encountered that one boss that we couldn't beat, or that one puzzle that seemed impossible to solve, and we get frustrated. And in the competitive community, we have been building the tools to kind of fight this frustration, to prevent it from escalating, and to still find the fun in something that doesn't always meet our expectations. And I think it's worth exploring that a lot of the times. So I just want to end this by saying that even though I've just presented to you a very negative view of the competitive community, I want to highlight the fact that there's just a lot of data on these negative moods on this side of gaming that can still be explored.
Excellent. So speaking of negative moods, I'm going to bring it back to kind of what was my research area. So I did an interview recently. I interviewed 20 participants with self-identified persistent low mood, so I didn't ask for a clinical diagnosis. And I basically just asked them what they would like to play if that changed when they were having a persistent low mood, and how they felt about their gameplay more generally, because there's kind of, particularly when it comes to low mood, there's a lot of stuff with the internet gaming disorder and addiction, but there's not so much kind of asking people necessarily how they relate to their gaming, or if they think that it's more of a help or a hindrance. So I have some initial findings. The salt is there not because people were salty, but because these are initial findings, so do take them with a pinch of salt. Watch the space for more detailed findings coming soon. But from my initial analysis, there are some interesting things I'll just talk about very briefly. So a common theme was using games as a way of finding yourself and kind of discovering things about yourself. And that was very specifically linked to more broader identity within life, and also kind of persistent low mood stuff, and kind of coming to terms with mental health. To bring it back to what G was saying, there was a subset of competitive gamers. And what I found interesting here was that a lot of them talked very negatively about their gaming, even when prompted with like questions asking about the positive. But they were also very kind of committed to that competitive scene. And it was almost like a lack of self-awareness, perhaps, in how negatively they were talking about it. I have the thing called, which I've temporarily called the Stardew Valley effect, which is came up a lot with simulation games, but also other games, which was when people were experiencing persistent low mood, they tended to want to do repetitive tasks, or the kind of, I guess, like grinding behavior that you can find in those sorts of games. And then there was some interesting interaction with persistent low mood and changing gameplay habits, but this wasn't true of every participant. It seemed to be a very individual basis. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. We are both looking for placements, and our contact details up here. And as I said, please do look out for the full analysis, which will be coming soon with regards to that, if you're interested.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, we are free for now.
Yes, we have run over time, so if people want to, I think the next talks are at 3:30, so if anyone does want to go have a coffee break rather than listen to our questions, that is also very understandable.